Hello, and welcome to our lecture for the fourth chapter of Knowledge, a Very Short Introduction, Analyzing Knowledge. Today we're going to be talking about some of the concepts we might employ in trying to understand what knowledge is. Now, knowledge is obviously a very important term in epistemology. In fact, epistemology just is the study of knowledge. Well, it's surprisingly tricky to define what that means, as we'll find out as we go through this lecture. Now, again, I will be assuming that you have read Knowledge, a Very Short Introduction, Chapter 4. So if you haven't, make sure to go back and read that, then continue. So our goal here is to try to define knowledge. Specifically, we're looking for a special kind of definition that philosophers would call a necessary and sufficient definition. That is, something that describes the necessary conditions, what something has to have to qualify as knowledge, and the sufficient conditions, that is the minimum things that would make a certain belief knowledge, right? Don't worry too much about getting a handle on necessity and sufficiency right now, but the idea is we're looking for a very precise definition. We're looking for one that will tell us exactly what it means to have knowledge and nothing more. So let's take a look at some of the key issues in this search for the meaning of knowledge. So one thing to talk about is the classical analysis of knowledge, or the JTB model. Now it's called the classical analysis because it dates back to Plato's Theaetetus, and Plato's a very classical thinker. I call it the JTB model because it's much more descriptive, justified, true belief. It was widely accepted for most of the history of Western philosophy that knowledge is just having a justified, true belief. Formally, S knows that P, if and only if. You'll see that I use IFF, by the way. That just means if and only if. Philosophers say that a lot because that is the way you lead into a necessary and sufficient condition. And so we just made a shorthand IFF. So S knows that P, if and only if. S believes that P. S is justified in believing that P. And P is true. This is a very intuitive way of thinking about knowledge, right? You only know something if it's true. That makes sense, right? You can't know a falsehood. And you only know something if you have a good reason. That is, if you're justified for believing it. Not if you believe it totally by happenstance, right? I might just arbitrarily decide that right now, on the opposite side of the world, someone is dancing, right? Dancing a polka. Or something like that, right? They're just having a party right on the opposite side of the world from me. But that's, one, not terribly likely considering the time difference, right? And two, I have no good reason to believe that. So even if I were right, we probably wouldn't want to call that knowledge. It's just being plain lucky. This idea was adopted in most of Western epistemology from its inception, while Plato was thinking and writing, up until about 1963, when a man named Edmund Gettier introduced what are now called Gettier problems. Problems for the justified true belief theory. So let's take an example. Imagine that you are driving down the road and you pass a friend's house or pass a neighbor's house, right? And you say, oh, well, I know that neighbor has a dog. And look over there, I see a dog shape in the shadows. So what does that tell me? Well, it tells me that their dog is outside in their backyard, right? Because I see this dog shape in their backyard. Now, let's say that, okay, well, yeah, so there's justification. I see a dog shape. It is probably a dog. Right? Usually, right? That's going to be a dog. And let's say that it's true. Their dog is outside. But here's the trick. That dog shape is not caused by the dog. What it's caused by is a bunch of topiaries, fancy bushes, that neighbor just had installed today because they looked like their dog. They really like their dog, right? So they have all these bushes that look like their dog around now. So I have a justified belief. I saw a dog shape. It's justified, presumably, to say, hey, there's a dog over there. It's a true belief because the dog is outside. But the weird thing is, I'm not looking at the dog when I'm making that conclusion. I'm looking at a dog bush. In fact, the dog is on the other side of the house. I can't see the dog at all. There's no way I could be using that information. So this is a Gettier problem. It looks like you can have a justified true belief that nonetheless seems really weird to call knowledge. Essentially, I just got lucky again. So most of modern or contemporary epistemology, since Edmund Gettier's paper, has been trying to develop a new way to think about knowledge that is at the very least resistant to these kinds of challenges, while also providing us something like the idea of knowledge that we presumably want, right? Because justified true belief did seem right for a long time. It does seem like it catches something. So we want to preserve that intuition, preserve what we seem to have caught in the justified true belief model, while accounting for these Gettier-style problems. So there are a couple of new models of knowledge that have come up from this. So there's the causal theory of knowledge. S knows that P if and only if the fact that P is causally connected in an appropriate way with S's believing that P. So I only count as knowing that their dog is outside, or that they have a dog, right? If the fact that that their dog is outside is causally connected in an appropriate way with me believing that P. Now, a lot of the causal theory is going to depend on this appropriate way idea. So let's change the example a little bit and say, okay, well, I know that they have a dog because I see a dog shape. Well, let's say that they got that dog-shaped bush, and then I don't know this person. They just have this dog-shaped bush. I'm just driving down the street and I see someone with this dog-shaped bush. And I say, well, they have a dog because I can see this dog shape off in the distance in the shadows there. I can't make out what kind, but it's a dog. But it turns out that actually that's a bush. But here's a wrinkle. That bush was made to look like their dog. So now there is a causal connection between them having a dog and that bush being there, right? And me having this visual experience. But it doesn't seem to be the right kind of causal connection. What we'd really want is something like photons hitting the dog coming back to me, right? My visual experience being caused by the dog itself. But it's really tricky to define exactly what qualifies as an appropriate way. There's also no mention of justification or evidence here, and this is something that makes people very uncomfortable. We tend to want to have some sort of significance of the evidence that people have, or the justifications they have, to them having knowledge. In this case, it just has to be causally connected in the proper way, and if that proper way doesn't include justification, then it just isn't part of knowledge. Finally, there's this example they give in the book, which I think is kind of amusing, called fake barn county. This idea of, so you're driving through a town and you see a bunch of barns along the road and say, oh, look, there's a barn. And let's say that this one actually is a barn. But little did you know that you're driving through fake barn county. That is, people just make fake barns here for the heck of it. And that one just happened to be the one real barn in fake barn county. It's causally connected in an appropriate way, but it still doesn't seem like knowledge because, again, there's this feeling that you just got lucky, right? This resulted in Goldman, the same man who presented the causal theory, presenting reliabilism a few years later. And this reliabilist view of knowledge is that S knows that P, if and only if their belief that P is a product of a reliable belief-producing mechanism and P is true. Now, immediately, you should be having the same reaction we had for the causal theory when they said appropriate with the word reliable. What does reliable mean? How reliable do we have to be? Different contexts seem to require different standards of reliability, right? Do I know there's not a camel in the hallway? Yeah, I know there's not a camel in the hallway. In fact, I know very, very well. But think about comparing something like, it's statistically unlikely that your child is allergic to peanuts. When you give them a peanut, though, right, do you say you know they're not allergic? Right? Should you act as though you know they're not allergic? Because it could kill them if you're wrong. Now compare this to something like, oh, I don't know, knowing that today is Tuesday. Or knowing that a tree is an oak tree. You seem to be allowed to be a little bit less reliable in those contexts because the stakes are different. This just indicates even further that not only is it hard to give a definition for reliable, but we need to have a flexible definition on top of that, which is going to be really complex and very difficult to develop. This sort of risk-sensitive notion of reliability. Likewise, you can make a version of the fake barn county here, right? So how reliable does it need to be? Well, it's a reliable barn indicating process. This is something called the generality problem, and we'll talk about this next chapter, but it's worth noting here. So neither of these theories have been entirely successful. One thing we might do then is say, okay, well, we had this old view, and we tried fixing it, and maybe the Gettier problem just shows that we can't do this the way we thought. So one way to talk about it is say there's no univocal concept. That is to say that knowledge is what's called polyvocal, many-voiced, or having many different meanings. There's no idea of knowing. There is no one concept of knowing that is relevant for epistemology. Rather, there's just a whole bunch. Now, epistemologists tend not to be happy with this view because it kind of just negates or at least alters the field significantly. And there does seem to be a push of, okay, well, what do all of those cases share? That's what we mean by knowing then, and we want to talk about that. Now, we might say that, well, maybe knowledge is the basic unanalyzable term here. The way that epistemology tends to work is to describe knowledge as a kind of belief. But we can alternatively say that belief is a mirror of knowledge, or sort of an instance of knowledge, or a token of knowledge, or a representation of knowledge. That is, to say that you believe something is just to say that you're going to act as though you know it. Right? Act as though you know whatever it is. In this case, knowledge becomes this basic regulative ideal. That is, you're just going to govern yourself in virtue of trying to achieve this ideal, but just like a perfect circle, you're probably never going to find one in the real world. Doesn't mean it's not useful. It's a good abstract concept. But really what we're dealing with is that knowledge is the basic term. It can't be broken down any further down than it already is. And what epistemology is then about is developing beliefs that are accurately close, or at least minimally appropriate to the shape of knowledge, right? This ideal. Now, this is kind of weird in a couple ways. One of them being it's not clear exactly how you'd propose we go about doing epistemology at that point, right? So, okay, well, how do we talk about believing well, and whether or not it actually changes things? Because we still want to know what counts as being close to knowledge. Right? Just like, so we could take a perfect circle and we could talk about being closer or further, right? A square is probably further than an octagon because they've got closer to a circular shape, right? Well, you know, that's all well and good, but it's not clear how we do that with knowledge. There are two alternative approaches, replacement approaches, which want to, in fact, just get rid of the field of epistemology or replace its basic terms or its basic ideas with a different challenge. So one is called replacement naturalism, and this is most famously supported by a philosopher named William Van Orman Quine. And Quine says, well, what we need to do is just replace epistemology with cognitive science. Epistemology is supposed to be about thinking properly. Well, guess who can tell us how to do that? Cognitive scientists, people who study thinking. So that's one approach. Say, well, let's just tear it down and start over. Let's talk about the science of thinking and thinking clearly. You see this a lot with these people who talk about eliminating psychological biases in our reasoning, and these sort of self-help books, right? They talk about how to use the fact that the information we have about how our brain works to make it more accurate. So that's one approach. People don't like this because it's sort of negating the basic terms of epistemology and would require a very different approach, but it's something worth thinking about. Similarly, replacement pragmatism, a view endorsed by Rorty, says that we shouldn't be working about knowledge or truth so much as the practical consequences of different systems of belief. And what epistemology should be concerned with is developing a system to compare ways of picturing the world so that we can tell which one is better. So these are some ways we might analyze knowledge. Some questions for us moving forward is, do we think knowledge can or should be analyzed? If so, what sort of approach is appropriate? Now, it's important to note that in epistemology, knowledge is typically considered to be a normative concept. That is, we should try to know. This is the thing we're trying to be. Knowledge has roughly the same idea as goodness in ethics. Well, if we don't know what that thing means, though, if we don't have a theory of knowledge, then we kind of end up wandering around in the woods with no real way to direct our thinking. So if epistemology is to be useful, at least as classically pictured, or even at all, we have two options. Define knowledge, or develop an epistemology that can tolerate not having it defined. So those are the things for you to be thinking about, right? Can we define knowledge? Should we define knowledge? Or should we go a different route with it? And if so, what different route should we take? So that's all for our Chapter 4 lecture, and I will see you next time.